Alright, I'm going to be demonstrating how to make a little bit of album artwork for an EP, and so this is really just a super basic overview of how do we create a square document in Photoshop and do some really basic photo manipulation. Photoshop is obviously an incredibly powerful tool that we could spend an entire semester class on diving into, so we're not going to get super into Photoshop tutorials because your specific creative ideas will be using different tools and techniques, and I really encourage you to take advantage of YouTube, where you can just search Photoshop tutorial and you'll find tons of super cool effects. So I've created this sort of minimal little floral artwork here just as a basis. We'll go ahead and create this to get you some of the basic interface of Photoshop and ideas for how to create this. So what I'm going to do in Photoshop is create a new document, and I'm going to change this to pixels for my units, and I'm going to make my width and my height both 1080. So that's going to give me a square file that is the height of a standard HD window. So that should be plenty high resolution. I want to check artboards. That's really helpful in this case, and we're going to make sure our resolution is set to 300 pixels per inch. We'll use, you probably have to change this to 16-bit RGB color, and then your background contents, you want to make sure that's set to white. And so we've got a 1080 by 1080 pixel artboard, 300 pixels per inch, 16-bit color, and a white background. So when we hit create, here's our document. It has a square artboard. Everything's going to be contained in that, and now we've got the proper aspect ratio, 1:1, for album art. So I went ahead already and grabbed an image from the internet. I'll show you to you right here. It's this little picture of some flowers, sort of a drawing from maybe like an old poster or textbook or something. In Photoshop, I'm going to open that up by hitting Command O, and then I'm just going to open my file. It's going to open it in its own window, and I want everything from this photo brought into my album art that I'm creating. And so I'm going to hit Command A to highlight everything, Command C to copy, and then back in my album art file, I'm going to hit Command V to paste. And you'll notice it's a really big file. This was a high resolution photo, so it doesn't all fit at once. So I can drag it around, and honestly, may find a place that looks kind of cool for album art just there. But I want to show you how to do some really basic stuff like moving and resizing images. And so when I click on this, I can see over here under properties, the transform, I have a width and a height parameter, and they are fixed in aspect ratio to keep me from squishing or stretching this. If I wanted to squish or stretch, I'd uncheck this maintain aspect ratio. So I know this image is taller than it is wide, and so I'm going to work with the height and set that to 1080 pixels and hit enter. And now it fits perfectly vertically, and of course it's not a square, so it doesn't fill the whole window. But if I wanted to make sure this was centered perfectly, these tools along the top are really useful. So I can center it horizontally and center it vertically, and now it fits perfectly in my screen. So this isn't too bad. What I probably would want to do then is make sure it looks like it fills the entire background. So I could do a couple things. I'm going to first hit Command T to transform, and now I've got my image in a way where I can resize it from the corners without squishing it. If I did want to squish it, I could, I guess this, if I did want to squish it, I'd hold Shift, but I don't. So I can resize from the corners. I can hold Option to resize about the center. And so I might pull it into a little bit smaller size. I think right there looks good, and hit check to confirm. I can make sure it's centered by using those buttons. And then what I'm going to do is actually create underneath this a layer that has this sort of beige fill. And so I'm going to come down here and click on my new layers button and click solid color. And so this already chose the color that I had chosen in my previous tutorial, but I'm going to set it to some crazy color for now and hit OK and drag that below layer 1. So you can see that's sort of my new background. Now, what I want to do is double click there, and in this window, if I hover over my image, I get this little eyedropper where I can pick a color from the image. So if anywhere I click, it becomes that color. So there's a lot of beautiful colors in this image already. If I wanted to get rid of the background, what I might do is just click on that solid background, and it pretty much disappears. You can see there's still a little bit of a rectangle. It looks like this was not a perfectly uniform digitally created background, but I kind of like how this is looking, so I'm going to click there, and I've already gotten rid of most of my bounding box square, so that's a good start. But the next thing I want to do is select my flowers layer, and go up to select, and there's some really useful options here. I could use the color range to select the background. I'm going to choose subject, and Photoshop's actually going to look at this picture and decide what it thinks is the subject. This is pretty straightforward since it has such a clear foreground background. It did a nice job. Now if I were to hit delete right now, I'd delete the flowers out. I want to do the opposite, so I'm going to go to select and choose inverse, and now I'm going to press delete. And if I hit Command D, I will deselect. And you'll notice that that box that was hiding around my flowers is gone. And if I hide this layer, I have really just the flowers left over after all. So I still like the color they were on in the background, so I'm going to leave it. I'm going to center up my image, and then I'm going to hit Command C, Command V to create a copy of it, Command T for transform, and then I'm going to hold Shift when I go outside this corner so I can rotate it in even increments. And I'm going to try creating a couple copies of this image. Remember to hit check when you're done with transform. This looks kind of neat how we've got these two directions. It's almost like little arrows. I'm going to do the same process again. Copy, paste, Command T for transform, hold Shift, and I might go somewhere in between now. I kind of like this 3-spoke design, so I'm going to hit check. Now I like this, but I want my 2-spoke legs of these green stems to be at the bottom, so I'm going to hold Shift and click all 3 of these layers, Command T to transform, and again holding Shift I'm going to rotate until I get that nice vertical. So I think that looks good. I'm going to hit check, and then I'm going to recenter everything using those. Now I'm not super happy with the change I just made. Oh, it looks okay. I could continue to move these flowers around independent of one another. I kind of like how things look right now. I might highlight these 3 layers and just visually center them a little bit better. They're okay where they are, but I'm using my arrow keys to move them around. That looks pretty good. I've got my centered artwork, and the last thing I want to do is I like a clean geometric border around it. So I'm going to grab from down here my rectangle tool, which shares a space with the ellipse and triangle tools. If I hold Shift while I drag with my rectangle tool, I'll get a square. So there it is. It maintained my previous fill and stroke settings. So what I want to do is say no fill so that this rectangle doesn't cover up my other artwork. And then for stroke, I'm going to I clicked on this little HSB window. I can either pick a color from within my image, I kind of like that red, or I can manually drag into the corner and drag this up to get pure white. Okay, so I've got that. I want to go up a little bit to the height and width of my square, and I'm going to make it as big as my image, so I'm going to say 1080, and now it's the exact size of my window. If I click on my square, rectangle 1, I should be able to use these center tools again to make it perfectly centered. Now it's basically disappeared, and that's just because the stroke is so thin. And so I'm going to yank this stroke slider up a bit so we can start to see it. The other thing is half of my stroke is off the image right now, so I'm going to change this from stroke centered about my theoretically infinitely thin line to on the inside of it. And now I can use this slider to create a border of the thickness that I like of my rectangle. I could again go back and change the colors. There were some really nice warm colors in this image, so maybe I want one of these warm reds. Let's see what that looks like. Ooh, that totally transforms it in my opinion. And I might just want a slightly lighter version of that red, so I would slide this slider up, say OK, and now I've got some really basic artwork. So Photoshop is full of tools you can use to manipulate images, but for the basic one, it's just for this class going to be about setting up your file with the correct dimensions, being able to use the transform and centering tools to move your image around, and then there are so many ways to remove the background from an image or remove parts of an image in Photoshop. I'm not going to get into too many of them, but often select focus area or select color range and then inverse and then delete is useful. So there's a couple of tools you can use to create some basic work. Of course, you could come in and use these other geometric features to create and draw. There's a text feature in Photoshop if you wanted to add the title of your EP to the cover as well as your artist name. That'd be great. When you're finished, you're going to go to File, and we're going to save as. We do want to save this Photoshop document. I'm going to save mine to my computer. Yours should go in your Janturn folder, so I would just call this album art. We'll save that. This way we can come back and make changes later to our actual Photoshop document. Maybe I want to hide some of these flowers. Up to you. I kind of like how it looks there. But to export it so we can actually use it, we're going to go to File, Export As. And there are lots and lots of things to think about with image types. PNG is going to be just fine for this class. Transparency, we could leave checked or unchecked. Ultimately, you really shouldn't have transparency in album art, in my opinion, just because it's meant to be printed and opaque. So I'm going to uncheck that. We're going to leave our height and width the same. Metadata isn't going to matter too much, and so we're just going to say export, and we should get a window asking where. I'm going to put it with the other one called album art, only this is my PNG. I'll hit save, and now if I go in Finder, there is my album art. I can open it up. It's a nice high quality image that I could do. I could embed on my Google site. I could print out. I could do all kinds of things with.